So now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to our speaker. Ilan Stavans is Lewis-Sebring Professor of Humanities, Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College, the publisher of Restless Books, and a consultant to the Oxford English Dictionary. He is the author of the award-winning Quixote, the Novel and the World, which is available via paperback. It was published in 2015. His most recent books are The People's Tongue, How Yiddish Changed America and How America Changed Yiddish, Popol Vuh, a retelling, and the children's book, The Mexican Dreidel, which I just have to say was a very popular title at our library. So sit back, relax, and prepare to learn so much about Don Quixote, and please join me in welcoming Professor Stavans.
Thank you very much, Lucinda. It is a pleasure to be here. I want to begin by wishing everybody a very happy new year, and by celebrating this extraordinary idea that Vermonters have and have been sustaining for quite some time, bringing everybody to a public library on the first Wednesday of the month. It turns the public library into a place of encounter, of dialogue, of civil discourse, and it furnishes and pushes forward our democracy in all kinds of ways. I wish that other parts of the country followed up, and I have been humbled and I'm honored to return to this wonderful program. Very thankful to the supporters, and very thankful in particular to the Vermont Public Libraries. What better opportunity than to talk about my favorite book? Without a doubt, that adjective, favorite, is centerpiece for me, and I use it as I do when I talk about a best friend. Yes, Don Quixote, the book, is a best friend to me, has been for many, many decades. And I often think of the definition of a best friend when I think of the book. A best friend is someone who navigates life with you and who is a companion, who is who with whom you bounce ideas, who is a kind of mirror of who you are, listens carefully, but also invites you to listen and to see others reflected in it. To me, Don Quixote is a novel, but it is also a kind of I Ching, a book that I can open up in any part, and it offers wisdom, and that wisdom changes depending on the moment that I find myself in life. I think this is a pertinent moment to talk about the definition of a classic. A classic is a book, said Mark Twain once, that everybody knows, but nobody reads. And perhaps there is no better example for that definition than Don Quixote. This is a book that many people know, and in fact, you can ask them to summarize. They will tell you it's about a pair of friends, one thin and one fat, one tall and one short, one an idealist and the other one a materialist, that go through a series of adventures. And then in the end, and they won't be able to tell you more about it, that there is a beautiful lady called Dulcinea, and that there is a donkey, then there is a horse. Many people know Don Quixote, I would say, out of osmosis, because we hear about Don Quixote from other aspects and layers in life, and because it is often turn into a cartoon, or turn into a movie, or turn into a play, or it shows up as little figurines that you can buy. And because the term Quixote has been transformed into an adjective, the quixotic, I invite you to think for a second of the characters in literature whose name has been accommodated to become an adjective. We don't have the term Macbethian or King Learian or Hamletian. We have other characters, but they are very few. And that, I think, calls attention to an aspect that the character of Don Quixote and the novel of Don Quixote invite us to think about. And that is that this is a novel that has changed the way we perceive the world. We are able to identify certain characteristics in people, in events, in landscapes, in actions, in plots that are quixotic. And they do so because the character has been turned into a myth or an icon or a view that we all have incorporated, that has been injected into our culture, and that you don't really need to know the book. You don't really need to know that closely the character in order to identify this with. Another definition of a classic, though, is a book that is patient and that waits for you to be reread. And that, again, is a very suitable portrait of what Don Quixote is. I first read this book when I was in my late teens. It was, in some ways, an invitation from my father who said, "You consider yourself a well-read young man? Well, go to the most important book, Don Quixote, and see what you think of it." I was probably 18 or 19. And because it was coming from my father, I thought, I am not going to like this book. It feels like a command that I have to fulfill. I opened a copy that I had at that time. I am a native Mexican, and I read it originally in the language in which Cervantes wrote it. And I found it to be buffoonish, clownish, um, frag- fragmented, sometimes incoherent, the book of an old man who dreams that he is still young. And though I understood the value that the book had, I felt that previous generations had overpraised it, over celebrated it, and that I could do without Don Quixote. It wasn't a book that I needed to have close to me. In fact, that very first edition, which I scribbled on all kinds of marginalia, unfortunately ended up in some garbage disposal. I don't have it with me. I wish I did, because it would be a testament to the first reading that I did, the young man who approached it and the perspective that he had. But the book has been patient, like a good friend again. And throughout life, I have reopened it time and again. I opened it in my late 20s and discovered that there was something more than I had first seen when I read the book on my father's request or command. And throughout life, I have returned time and time again. Now that I'm 62, now that I am older than Cervantes was when he died in 1616, I see it from a very different perspective. I see this not as the book of an old man who wanted to be young, but the book of an old man who realizes that if you give up being young, your old age is going to turn you into a sour entity, and that the connection between youth and old age is crucial to retain a sense of wonder, of curiosity, of passion, and of engagement with the world. I now don't find Don Quixote in any way clownish or buffoonish or dull and stupid as I did. I found him wise and persuasive and admirable, to the point that if and when somebody describes me as quixotic, I am excited, thrilled by that definition, by that adjective. So a book that is a classic is a book that will wait to be reread and that will accept the various generations of you returning to it, but it will do something else. It will invite you to land on its pages, as Don Quixote does, as one more of the readers that have come to it from the moment in which it was published. This book has more than 400 years of existence. It has been around the world, circling it time and time again in different adventures. And one of the greatest pleasures is to see what others have thought of it, how the many different readers from Borges to Nabokov to Kafka to Toni Morrison and others have found in it a source of inspiration, of endurance, of puzzle. And that is probably to me the best definition of a classic, and of this particular classic, a book that with its patience, with its continuity, creates a community of readers, not only in the present tense, but across time. You read it along with those that have read it before, and you're in conversation with them by seeing the marginalia that they left behind. Again, Nabokov and Borges and Toni Morrison, and William Faulkner, who used to say that he read Don Quixote every year in order to sustain himself, Mark Twain, to the very readers that are contemporaneous with you. And I have one of the greatest pleasures connected with Don Quixote, and that is that every other year I teach a course at Amherst. I've also taught it in different institutions, and that course allows me to introduce for the very first time this magisterial novel to a new generation of readers who come to it with some knowledge, but cold and disposed to be wondered and shaken and also reinvigorated to it. But there's also the conversation that one has with the classic, and with Don Quixote in particular, with the readers that have yet to be born, with those ones that are our children and our grandchildren and future generations, who will come to this book and find us, what we left behind as clues, as part of that conversation. It has constant and eternal presence. It is made of pages that are statements of the various successive presents that are just in the middle of that journey, and it will continue. And how wonderful to think that this book, when we're no longer here, will be around like the moon, like the color red, like symphonies by Mozart and by Beethoven, and that it will be accessed by those who are yet to come and be transformed by it. At the same time, friends, this is a very peculiar book, very strange, very imperfect. And one of the definitions of the classic, too, is an imperfect book that is made perfect by the various readers that come to it, that find in its imperfections a perfect statement of our humanity. It's a book that it is long, um, full of descriptions that sometimes feel arbitrary. At times, Cervantes gives us the impression that he has fallen asleep while doing the writing. His style can be messy. I'm not the first one to say it. Nabokov said it. Borges said it. It is a book whose idea, or the central idea of it, is far superior than the execution. And yet it survives its messiness, its kind of chaotic nature, precisely because it is so full of ideas and of intent, and we can go beyond that fractured nature, that accidental quality of the book, and be able to embrace it as a whole. It tells the story, as you know, of an hidalgo, a term in 17th century Spain that described a person that belonged to the noble class, but that had, for a variety of reasons, lost its connection with fortune and with its own title and honor. And in this case, he is idle. He spends his days and nights reading chivalry books until, and that is one of the beautiful aspects of the first chapter, until his brains, Alonso Quijanos's brains, dry up, and he becomes one of the characters that he has been reading. This is just a marvelous metamorphosis. In many ways, that is why Kafka loved it so much. It is the story of a character that just shows up at the very beginning of chapter one, and by the end of chapter one, he is no longer the hidalgo that he was. He is now a kind of superhero, a man who thinks he has superpowers. He is a knight that is going to go out and fix the world, mend it. In that sense, this is a book that announces the end of a literary tradition, the tradition of chivalry novels, that was widely and broadly popular in the 15th century and the 16th century, up until the very beginning of the 17th century in France, in Portugal, in Spain, in other parts of Europe, that was as appealing as romance novels today, or maybe detective novels, or maybe science fiction, a genre literature that often was considered to be not serious enough. This is something we should remember. Cervantes was considered an unserious writer in his time, writing a type of literature that was for the masses and not for the educated elite. That educated elite, from the moment the book was published, looked down at him and looked down at the novel as unworthy and melodramatic, pamphletary, really more to satisfy the need of the population, the larger population, than to offer an advance in aesthetic modes and aesthetic beauty. It is for that reason that it is a book about books. It is the story of a man who reads too much, and as a result of that, is transformed into one of the characters of the book. And I find this to be delicious. What are the consequences of reading too much? In what way do we lose a track, roots, connection with reality, and we start dreaming? And that very concept, the idea that the dream, the imagination that we employ when we're reading takes over us, is one that has allowed many to consider this to be the first psychological novel. A novel in which a character, Alonso Quijano, loses his sense of identity and comes up with an alternative identity in order to navigate a world that is unique, that is challenging, and that needs all kinds of psychological tools and resources in order to be navigated. Um, he is an older man. He is reaching 50, which is roughly the age that Cervantes, a man born in central Spain in 1547, who had been a soldier, was a minor poet, a minor playwright, had tried his hand at writing novellas. And then at that age of 50 or coming close to it, decided to try a new form of literature that was the chivalry novel that was also a parody of that novel, a way of turning it upside down. What is really a parody? A parody is a way of presenting a, a plot while reminding the audience that there's a subplot behind. When we are reading Don Quixote, we need to be very aware that this is a novel that brings forth the whole tradition of chivalry, of knights and ladies and courtly love. And that tradition might be remote to us, but the book is so powerful, so shrewdly construed, so capably built that we don't have to have read as many novels as Alonso Quijano reads in the chivalry tradition to understand what he is becoming a parody of. We will quickly understand his clumsiness, his incapacity to be the hero that other heroes were at that time, Amadis de Gaula, and so many others. And we will also understand, and this is the other part that is very important, just as this novel announces the end of that great literary tradition in Europe, it also announces the birth of the modern novel, not only the psychological novel, but the modern novel as such. And I want you just for a second to consider what our worlds today in 2023 would be if the novel as a literary form did not exist. I think that there would be a huge vacuum, a huge hole, emptiness before us. We read novels voraciously, we read novels persistently because we want to see ourselves reflected in characters that do intelligent things or foolish things. And because that connection with seeing ourselves reflected enhances our sense of worth or amplifies our anxieties or makes us realize that we are truly human, the novel is this artifact that emerged in the 17th century as a modern artifact. There are novels that have an old-fashioned mode that precede that moment, where the character, and this is why Don Quixote is called the first modern novel, where the character begins in point A and ends in point Z. We witness a transformation of this character that is not unlike the transformation that we go through in a single day, in a single week, in a single month, a year, or a lifetime. We are never the same, and what is most constant in our life is change, transformation, mutation, metamorphosis. And what is most constant in Don Quixote is that the Alonso Quijano that shows up at the very beginning is very different as a result of all his adventures, of the Don Quixote back to Alonso Quijano that ends the first part of the novel. It's divided in two parts and certainly concludes with his death, the last and concluding part. That Don Quixote is now more humble, is now more down to earth. He has undergone what the Germans called the trajectory of the Bildungsroman, that transformation of the character. And that transformation doesn't show up in the characters of the Bible. The characters of the Bible are often mouthpieces for whatever aspect the writers of that particular chapter or that particular book want to present. And much more important, don't have an interior life. You hear the characters of the Bible, and Abraham said, or Jacob said, or Sarah said, or Moses said, such and such, but you don't hear them thinking. You don't hear them having doubts, or at least not in the complex, irresolute type of way. One of the beauties of Don Quixote is that you see the character, Don Quixote, in two levels, navigating the feudal, awkward, primitive Spain of the early 17th century and navigating his own doubts, his own uncertainties in an interior way without ever finding easy, direct, packageable answers. What better statement of modern life than that? That interior sense of wonder and wonder that relate to each other and that push us forward. It is the internal monologue that we have on and on and on. And it's not as if Don Quixote, as if Cervantes is telling us in Cervantes, and Don Quixote thought this, or Sancho thought that, or Dulcinea, etc., but that in the dialogue that is happening all the time, there are clear cues and clues to the interior motivation that each of these characters have. It is essentially the story of a friendship of two men of very different backgrounds, one noble, one pseudo aristocratic, and one from the labor or working class, Sancho Panza. The first one unmarried, with no children, aloof, and an absolute idealist who thinks that the world is not what we see, but what we should see. And another, Sancho Panza, married, a materialist. He wants to be paid for his work, and he should be paid for his work. Is always bringing down to earth, to the here and now, Don Quixote, and the relationship that they have is both of friendship, but also of a mutual interest. Who understands that in this world you have to have money, and you have to have a family, and you have to have a clear sense of practicality that Don Quixote doesn't have. Now, the amazing thing, and I talk about many amazing things, dear friends, is that just as Don Quixote changes in the book from the beginning to the end, Sancho changes in the book from the beginning to the end, and Don Quixote becomes Sanchified by the end of the book. He becomes more and more like Sancho, and Sancho becomes Quixoticized. He becomes, through his friendship, more and more like Don Quixote. However, each of them retain their sense of difference, and you realize that this is what a friendship is, or this is what a true companionship is. They depend on each other. They dislike each other in many moments. They are lecturing each other in different ways, but they are also needing each other. And the relationship between the two is fortified by the different moments, by the different encounters that they go through. There are many aspects of the book that I could talk about. The ghostly presence of Dulcinea, who is only in the imagination of Don Quixote. She's really a Don San Lorenzo. We barely see her or hear of her in the book. We really never see her directly, but it is that courtly love, that platonic love that exists in the mind of Don Quixote, in which Sancho nurtures, that is very much essential to the way Western modern love has become as well. You know, when you think of Romeo and Juliet, they are not in a platonic relationship. They need each other. There is the physical presence, the desire for a kiss. I should remind everybody that Cervantes and Shakespeare were contemporaries and died the very same year, 1616. And in fact, for a while, people thought that they died even the exact same day, like the two famous founding fathers. But the fact is that England had one calendar and Spain had another one, and there was about 10 to 12 days in between. When Don Quixote was being written, Shakespeare was writing Hamlet, and so the idealism, that Danish prince that wants to act but doesn't act, and the Romeo and Juliet that need each other, the vision of love that they have for one another is a vision that has to do a lot with not only how Romeo loves Juliet, but how Romeo loves Romeo loving Juliet, and how Juliet is infatuated with herself loving Romeo. And that is something very much at the heart of Don Quixote. It's not who Dulcinea is, but how Don Quixote turns her into an engine to move forward and to justify many of his actions. The novel was written and published in two parts. The first one in 1615. Cervantes was at that time barely 50, just about. And there's a second part that was published in 1615, just a few months before Cervantes' death. The very first part of the book, the two parts are published now together, but when they originally appeared, the first one was alone. Cervantes left it open the way many chivalry novels were left open. And then the second part came 10 years later when Cervantes was already a much more seasoned writer, much more matured, and he understood the impact that his novel had on people. People would come to him and say, "Oh, give us more. What happens with the Dulcinea? What happens with Sancho? With what happens with Don Quixote?" So just like you get from the presidency, the first 4 years of a president that are in the United States, that are very different from the second period of a president. The first one is to prove that you're a good president. The second one is for posterity. In Don Quixote, you have the impression that the very first part is more entertaining, more theatrical. And the second part, where Cervantes realizes this is for posterity, it's deeper, more philosophical, more enduring, and it's better written than the first part, but they depend on each other, and they are the two sides of Cervantes himself. There is a beautiful aspect of the book. In the first part, Don Quixote and Sancho navigate the world, and Don Quixote is a reader who has stopped reading and yet continues to see the world as a book. He wants to find characters like in the windmills that look like giants, or somebody that looks like a dragon or looks like another monster that he would be fighting with. And in the second part, again, they were written 1 decade apart. Don Quixote and Sancho hear from readers of the first part their reaction to the book and compare themselves, what they think of themselves, to the version that people are telling them that they had read in the book. This is a book that is a meta book, in that it talks about itself in the reflections that the first part in literature in general project in the second part. There's a beautiful chapter also in the first part where Don Quixote is away in his room, and his two best friends, the priest and the barber, enter the personal library of Alonso Quijano and think that the best way to bring him back from his craziness is by destroying the books in the library. So, like the censors of the Inquisition, that every book had to satisfy at the time Don Quixote was published, They go book by book, title by title, and they say, oh, this book is a piece of trash. They throw it out the window in order for it to be burned. Or they rescue a book thinking that there is some hope in that book. It is a nod to the role of censors and to the role of the Inquisition in the shaping of literature of its time and in the shaping of Don Quixote. In a sweet and enduring quality of that chapter, chapter 6 of the first part, is when they find a book by Cervantes. The friends of Don Quixote find a book by Cervantes, La Galatea, and they comment on the book and they say, let us not destroy their book. Cervantes is not a good writer, but he might be better in the future. Let's give him a chance. Plus, he's a friend of ours. This is a book that it includes its literary criticism inside it. It's a novel that reads the world as much as it is being read by the world. And in that sense, it might explain why so many readers from so many different languages keep on coming to it. After the Bible, it is regularly mentioned as the book that sells the most copies all over the world. And think of this, I'm not comparing it to J.K. Rowling or Stephen King. In a single year, in a single decade, Rowling's or Stephen King might sell many more copies. But this, Don Quixote, is a book that has been selling steadily from the moment in which the first part was first published. In the first 1,800 copies took 7 years to sell out. It was very slow in catching up to the many copies that are published every year in many, many languages. I want to wrap things up. There's much that I can tell you, but I want to invite readers to reflect and offer their own comments by telling you two things that I think are very important. The first one is that, as in the case of Shakespeare, but with less validity and more shamelessness, even when we compare it to Shakespeare, there are every so often kind of a conspiracy theories that Cervantes did not exist, or that Cervantes didn't write the book, or that Cervantes wrote some portions of the book but not other portions of the book. You and I have